Good evening. It's Thursday, June 6th. This is KTN Prime on a Thursday evening. I'm Joroge Mwaura, and in the headlines tonight,
the British government recognizes that Kenyans were subject to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration.
Justice at last, or is it compensation for Mau Mau veterans?
Tunachidwa ni Mau gani?
Payout, fallout, could the real Mau Mau stand up? No journalists, please. National Assembly effects media ban.
The Speaker cites therefore misleading to report that the former Prime Minister was mistreated and handled differently from other dignitaries of his VIP status.
We are sorry. Government apologizes over Raila airport saga. We begin tonight with what has been hailed by human rights activists as a major victory for those who fought against British colonial rule. Now, earlier today, the British government offered to pay some 2.6 billion shillings for some 5,000 Mau Mau war veterans in an out-of-court settlement. Now, the announcement, which was made by the British Foreign Secretary William Hague in London, came with a veiled apology to victims of colonial torture. KTN senior reporter Rita Tinina has been following the day's developments and joins us now live from a city center studio. Rita, too little, too late, or victory all the same?
Well, Njoroge, it depends on who you ask. That amount translates to less than 500,000 shillings per victim, and while that may seem like little, many of the victims who are now in their 70s and 80s seem to have decided that in these last stages of their lives something is definitely better than nothing. Let's now take a look at how things went in London and here in Nairobi during and after that historic announcement.
But I'm a bit surprised that...
When the British Foreign Secretary William Hague rose to address the House of Commons in London, it was with an unusual and historic statement.
The British government recognizes that Kenyans were subject to torture and other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the colonial administration.
A first-time admission that the British government committed atrocities during the colonial era from 1952 to 1963. And for that, Her Majesty's government regrets the actions.
The British government sincerely regrets that these abuses took place.
The announcement comes with a 2.6 billion shilling out-of-court settlement for 5,228 victims of colonial torture who had sued the British government in 2009.
The government will also support the construction of a memorial in Nairobi to the victims of torture and ill treatment during the colonial era.
As the British Foreign Secretary made the announcement in London, in Nairobi, Mau Mau war veterans were celebrating, some still coming to terms with the news that their long search for justice had borne some fruit.
Tumekubali kile ambayo serikali ya Uingereza imetoa.
Today's victory only marks one step in the journey for justice.
We do not want our current and future relations with Kenya to be overshadowed by the past.
But even with the statement and the payout, the British government will not take liability.
We continue to deny liability on behalf of the government and British taxpayers today for the actions of the colonial administration.
The case will no doubt set a precedent for other victims of colonial torture. But for those who are set to receive their settlement from the British government, it is not all about the money. It is the symbolism of the apology offered by the former colonial master that they are most happy about.
Watu wanasema kimoja kilichoko mikononi ni kizuri kuliko 10 ambayo iko katika kichaka.
Rita Tinina, KTN. Well, the British government now says it will begin to process the settlement right away, and the victims are, of course, eagerly awaiting what many see as a somewhat happy ending to a very long quest for justice. Njoroge, back to you.
Thank you so much, Rita Tinina. Certainly a very big historic day for Mau Mau heroes, and certainly a thirst for the discredited former colonial empire. Now, let's go to the big question tonight, and we are asking you, do you think the apology by the British government is adequate? Now, we want to hear your responses and your yes or no with brief comments to the number 8040. We'll be sampling your views, of course, and announcing the poll results. Even before the news of the compensation package sank in, another group claiming to be the real war heroes has asked that the compensation be halted. The Splinter War Veterans Group say the legitimacy of those being awarded needs to be scrutinized further, but as KTN's Edith Kimani reports, this request may be a little ambitious and too late.
Derito Abugo is not shy to talk about his past. With 80 years to his name, he has plenty of memories to share. He tells us it took him a while to settle down. Women, he says, did not want to be married to troublemakers. 50 years on, and the joke is that everyone is related to a former Mau Mau fighter, especially after the settlement by the British government. But that money has changed everything and nothing for Abugo.
Huyu wakili anaitwa Mwite na Gitu Kahengeri wanapanga grufu yao na upendo wao, lakini sio upendo ya Mau Mau.
Kahengeri, one of the 3 veterans who sued London, is leading a separate Mau Mau group from the one that Wambogo is a part of. And there's more. GT Solicitors, Rabala, and Tandem Law are all different organizations said to be leading various Mau Mau groups.
Kwa hivyo hata sasa tunasikia ati hawa ndio watapeana pesa, tunachidu ni Mau Mau gani watu 5,000. Na hata serikali katika huko Akain pale tunawekewa mavailo yetu ni watu wengi kuliko hiyo.
I don't suppose there will ever be universally agreed figures about what happened and how many people were killed in such a confused and terrible situation.
This bullet wound to his leg is the only proof Wambogo has of his involvement in the war against the colonial masters. He claims he was shot by a colonialist, a hard sell in any court. But he says his group will try and get a separate compensation. Few options remain for those that were left out of the reparation, but Wambogo says he is a fighter. He fought for his wife, his land, and with today's announcement, he says he will continue to fight for justice. Edith Kimani, KTN Prime.
Thank you very much, Edith Kimani. I hope the crisis shall be sorted out. They've waited for years and the time is now. Let's talk more about this very historic case. That is the chronology of the Mau Mau cases themselves. We have Eric Njoka on the Super War. Eric, good evening.
Good evening, Moira.
Take it up.
Well, thank you very much. Now, you can remember it has been 4 years of seeking justice at the United Kingdom court, and it has been 50 years, nevertheless, for the country seeking justice from the colonialists. And what better way to do that and to remember the Mau Mau war veterans or the Mau Mau rebellion by looking at the history where it all began. And you can remember this is the decade before we got our independence. That's the from the year 1952 to the year 1960. This is the year commonly known as the Kenyan emergency. What the claims that were brought, these are the claims that were brought forward to the United Kingdom court by the claimants here. They say that the brutality of the British colonial government then during the Kenyan emergency in the year 1952 and 1960 caused them trouble. This is the year when they were detained and were taken to detention camps, and at the detention camps, this is what happens. They claim that there was widespread acts of brutality. They also claim that there were arbitrary killings. They also claim that, if you can have the next board there were severe physical assaults given to them, both women and men. And finally here there was extreme acts of inhuman treatment, which included rape and castration, both for women and men. Moving on to the claimants' cases, they sought to justice from the United Kingdom, saying that they wanted justice for them, and these were the 5 people who represented the Mau Mau war veterans in 2009. That is in June 2009, when the cases were brought forth to the United Kingdom courts. The 5 were Paulo Muoka Nzile, Wamboko Wanyinge, Jane Muthoni Mara. The others were Susan Shiongombe Ngondi, who died in 2010, unfortunately, and Ndiku Mutua, who pulled out of the case back then in 2010 as well. Looking at the claimants' team, this is the team that represented the claimants as well, supported them, gave them support, took them to the United Kingdom. This included the Mau Mau War Veterans Association, whose spokesman, however, is Nkitu Wakahengeri, and he has been very vocal about this. There is the Kenya Human Rights Commission, which was spearheaded by the Lady and Co solicitors, and then there was Paul Moite, who is the lawyer representing the victims. Let's move on to the other board here. We have to look at the milestones, when the case began and where we are right now. We'll begin with October 2009. This was when the evidence of authorization of torture was presented, and during this year the evidence that was presented to the court allegedly showing government knowledge and authorization of torture of Kenyans in the 1950s and 1960s. In April 2011, Kenyan Mau Mau uprising documents were released, and in this year thousands of files from former United Kingdom administrations were released by the government. The lawyer then, Dan Leader, said about 300 of the 2,000 boxes related to Kenya, about 30 of them were related to the Mau Mau war veterans. And in 2011, the same year, the United Kingdom government denied liability for their abuses. We can go to the next board now. There you are. In May 2011, the colonial secret papers were made public. In these secret papers, ministers wanted a claim for compensation from the 4 elderly Kenyans struck out by the High Court in London. In May 2011, the same year, this is actually we can move on to July 2011, where the Mau Mau were allowed to sue the United Kingdom officially. In 26th of July the same year, the first hearing of the alleged torture began. On the 18th, a year later, in July 2012, the second hearing into the alleged torture was carried forward. In July the same year, the Kenyan government refuses to finance the case. Now this is where the Kenya Human Rights said or alleges that the Kenyan government denied them finance to take the victims to present the cases at the United Kingdom. They say that they funded the ICC suspects instead. Looking at October 2012, this is when the United Kingdom court allowed the Mau Mau to proceed with the hearing, and finally today, June 2013, the United Kingdom government expressed regret and offered compensation of about 2.6 billion Kenya shillings, and said they're willing actually to give them or to put up a memorial for them. I'm sure James Smart will have a discussion for this, but before that, let's go back to Njoroge Mwaura.
Certainly a very, very comprehensive chronology there from Eric Njoka. Thank you very much, Eric. We have more on this very historic development. It's been a long wait, like we've said before, but it's paid off in the long run. Now, we have people who've been chasing this story from the Kenyan Human Rights Commission. They are in our studio, our physical studio. James Smart is standing by. Over to you, James.
Right, thank you very much, Njoroge, as you rightly mentioned there. In studio with me is the people at the center of these cases. I'm joined in studio by George Mara, who's the Kenya Human Rights Commission Senior Program Officer, and also Dan Leader, who's been one of the lawyers who've been working through these cases. Gentlemen, congratulations.
Thank you.
Big day.
Thank you very much. Very historic day.
What does it mean?
Well, it's historic because this is really the first time Britain has ever acknowledged that torture, widespread systematic torture, occurred during the colonial period. So for the Foreign Secretary to make a statement in the House of Commons, as he did today, is a very historic moment. And in addition, there is compensation, some compensation, but it's really the recognition of the British government for the first time and the apology that was given that is so noteworthy today.
But the British government still denies liability of what happened 50 years ago.
Well, I think the reason they're taking that line, again, is because they want to be very cautious. The court didn't find them liable, really, technically speaking, and so they're right by saying that they're not fully liable for the events of that time. But more important, they really want to be careful in case other groups from other colonies would come forward and stake claims similar to the Momo case.
So what does this mean then for the groups who are not represented? We're going to go for the groups who are represented and who are celebrating tonight. But for the groups who are not particularly represented and they feel tonight they're left out of the cold, tonight the 50 years of their hard sweat, of their families, of the heart and pain is being ignored or being looked over. What happens to them?
It's very important to understand what this case is about and what it is not. This case is not about colonialism. This case is not about the Mau Mau generally. This case is about torture and abuse of people while they were detained by the British colony. So we had a very rigorous process. We reviewed 50,000 cases. We then interviewed over a 9-month period, one by one, 15,000 people. And from there, we narrowed it down to 5,200 cases of torture and abuse. So it was a very robust period. Now, the gentleman who was on the clip earlier, he may have a case, he may have been missed. If it's just a case of being a Mau Mau fighter, then there's no claim. But if it's a case of him being tortured and abused, and it's a credible case, then there's nothing to stop him bringing that through his lawyers to the British government. We don't claim to have a complete monopoly on this at all.
In terms of what this does for this country, it rewrites our history, if you like. For the first time, we are able to go back to, say, 50 years ago, there were individuals or there was a government policy that really hurt the Kenyan people. What is it? Was it a policy or was it an individual act?
I think part of the case that our lawyers argued in court is that there was a deliberate policy to torture people. And as you rightly say, for us, as a country, this is really a first step for us to do a lot of self-introspection. And as Dan has clearly said, this case was very specific. It's not about all the ills that happened during the colonial era. I can say this having worked on the case for the last 5 years. But again, the UK government has taken responsibility for what happened. Now it's high time the Kenyan government took responsibility within the framework that we have, the Constitution and other institutions like the National Land Commission, to address the other pending issues that the Momo may still have.
Then the perception that this country has tonight is that the British government has, in Atago Arasup, said, listen, we're sorry, and this is the money we've given to cover for whatever it is that happened. It's not very clear. Is that really enough?
Well, I think you need to go back to the history, and I'm very pleased that your other reporter went through the history of this case, because this is unprecedented. This has never happened before in Britain's history, that we have accepted something like this and owned up to the own wrongs that were committed in the name of the British Crown. So it's extremely significant what happened today. And is it enough? It's never enough, obviously. There should always be more. You can never repay someone who was castrated or someone who suffered appalling sexual abuse or rapes. But it is an important recognition for the first time for these victims, these elderly victims of torture. And for them, the moment is highly significant. It cannot be overemphasized.
President George, the question, as we write this history, I would ask, Mau Mau represent part of the Kenyan history, part of what happened in the pre-independence. What happens to our narrative of this country? What happens to, the people who would say, well, there were such acts of torture and hurt in Rift Valley, in Western Kenya, in Coast Province? What happens to such narrative and history?
we as a commission actually, and I'm glad James you raised that, we've been very cautious and careful to also just get a complete narrative, because we understand Mau Mau, if you will, was the climax of a long struggle for this country's independence. And as a commission, we are working with researchers and scholars, historians. We've constructed the history of this country from Mekatilili Wamenza, Koitalel Samoei, coming down to Dinia Msambwa. We've gone down to Bondo, other parts of the country, Kisii, Masailand, and all that, to just understand the different narratives of liberation, if you will. And therefore, for us, this gives us a very good opportunity to really come to a conclusion of that long narrative of liberation, and as you rightly say, so that it's not only seen to have emanated from one.
Does it feel now, though, that really the story of Kenya really just emanated from this particular point, and the story of liberation, if you like, just came from this particular point?
Well, we want it to be seen as being the climax, and the reason why we are doing what we are doing is to actually thread Kenya's liberation narrative to show that indeed 1952 just didn't happen. There is a history of resistance. People who have human dignity, like all human beings, Africans and all this, wouldn't want to live in bondage, and therefore the first act of resistance speaks to that. And while there are those ones who have wanted us to believe that only Mau Mau was the big part of Kenya's liberation, historically it played a big role, but we cannot forget the long narrative that we're trying to piece together.
Then this is interesting, because the British government has accepted some say, well, it's not clear what we did, but from the part that that has been clearly stated there, we say sorry for whatever it is, and there's a little compensation. Where's the Kenyan government? Where does the Kenyan government come through to this narrative and say, well, these are our people and we took over this administration, and that compensation alone is not enough, and this is how we plan to further it? Where is the place of the Kenyan government in this?
Well, initially the Kenyan government was very supportive, and when the British government were asserting, as they were early on in this case, that the liability for these colonial atrocities was inherited by the Kenyan Republic, and that if anyone had a lawsuit they wanted to bring, they should sue the current Kenyan government, they issued a very strong statement. I suppose I'm surprised that nothing has been said today by the Kenyan government, but perhaps they will. I think you need to address that question.
But what will their place? I mean, just think about it. What would their place be in terms of they inherited that government, and the British government was right at that particular point, but in terms of inheriting the liability, in terms of inheriting part of what happens now, what happens to them?
Well, I mean, I can talk about the British court proceedings, and I can talk about the case, and basically what the judge said there is he rejected the argument of the British government, and said actually if you looked at what happened in the Kenyan emergency in 1952 to 1960, the entire Mau Mau uprising was being managed or fought against directly from London. So he said actually you can trace this all the way back to London. The British government is liable. So he rejected that argument, and he didn't say that we should just focus on the Kenyan government. Now, the degree to which the Kenyan government should be focused on now is really a matter for the KHRC. I can't get involved in that.
Let me ask that specific question. Really, what's the place of the Kenyan government now? As you say, still these questions would come. There's still many people that will come through and say, well, that particular case is fine, it's good, but there are more of us, hundreds of thousands, who are involved in this fight for liberation. What happens to the Kenyan government?
Well, in a few words, actually, the British government has been held accountable for what happened, and the Kenyan government should also be held accountable for what happened. And as we say today, we will start that conversation and discussion with the Kenyan government so that they also carry their weight, the part that needs to be concluded by the Kenyan government. Recently, we have the TGRC report that was released. It provides a good framework. We have a beautiful constitution, provides a good framework. We have the National Land Commission. So all these internal mechanisms, if we work together, I'm sure we can really create a path towards true and full healing for this country, which will then move us forward.
George Murara, Kenya Human Rights Commission, and Dan Leader, lawyer, thank you very much. Thank you. Do let me know when the money is wired.
Well, we'll let you know.
All right. That's the conversation, that's discussion. Obviously and definitely we'll keep at this story in Njoroge, and it develops, if you like.
It might be too little, too late, but it's better than nothing. James Matt will be back with the real live wire later on after this newscast. Let's stay away from Mau Mau matters now. Elsewhere, President Uhuru Kenyatta chaired his first cabinet meeting this afternoon following the swearing-in of its last two members, Joseph Ole Lenku of the Interior Docket and Kazungu Kambi of Labour. Now, during the ceremony held at State House, Nairobi, the president challenged the newly sworn-in cabinet secretaries to be transparent and accessible to Kenyans. The president told the new officials to ensure the government delivers on the promises made by the Jubilee Alliance during the campaigns. The president exuded confidence in the team, saying it was capable of achieving the targets owing to what he called the competitive selection process they underwent. At the other arm of government, the legislature, that ban on journalists took full effect, with security personnel briefed to keep media at bay. Now, journalists remained locked out for the entire day, with only the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation staff allowed to cover the afternoon session. KTN Samogina got a feel of the new unexpected policy at Parliament.
Mid-morning, and journalists were at Parliament buildings seeking to catch the day's news. That is a statement due on Prime Minister's alleged harassment at the airport and, of course, the media exclusion saga itself. But they were in for a rude shock. The directive to keep them at bay was taking effect. In their brief, the security officers are to vet journalists and establish their purpose of visiting the National Assembly. Media houses are now required to inform Parliament before dispatching their crew to the National Assembly, and Parliament will only admit journalists bearing parliamentary accreditation, save for staff of the state broadcaster.
Mimi ni kama wewe tu. Si umetumwa na watu wetu. Sasa sisi tumetumwa hapa na watu wetu. Yes. Mimi naambiwa watu amri, unaambia watu usitaki kuona wakai kaende. So ni kazi yangu pia mimi nashuka. Ndio. Kweli.
On Wednesday, the National Assembly clerk Justin Bundi declared that Parliament was not going to create residence for journalists at Parliament buildings, and with that, he sent parliamentary reporters packing. Reports indicate the move to eject journalists was adopted at a House Business Committee meeting Tuesday evening under the guise of pressure for space to accommodate MPs. But the House Speaker downplayed the matter, saying the journalists' eviction from the media center is temporary.
Arrangements are being made to accommodate the media temporarily in some other different location. But before that happens, I think they should just use the available spaces.
The media coverage on MPs' salary saga is reported to be the flashpoint for the radical move, with MPs seemingly on a revenge mission to curtail the bad publicity they have been generating. 3 months into their term, the MPs have only approved the list of the President Cabinet Secretaries. Most of the time wasted on bickering and clamor for a pay hike at the expense of legislative agenda. Sam Gina, KTN, Nairobi.
Now to yet another twist in the ICC saga. A group of 94 people claiming to be victims of the 2008 post-election violence now say they want to withdraw from the case. The group says it has written to the Hague-based court to say they no longer trust the process. KTN's Asha Mwilu has more.
Of the evidence at each stage of the proceeding.
The ICC prosecutor is walking a tightrope with the cases that only a year ago looked set to run and end well. Through this letter said to have been sent to the ICC, some 94 persons who identify themselves as victims of the post-election violence say they are no longer confident in the process. They argue that the Office of the Prosecution is only focusing on the 2 Kenyan cases and using victims as a stepping stone. The victims say they're not sure the real instigators of the post-election violence will ever be brought to book. In the signed statement, the victims accused the Office of the Prosecutor of not conducting thorough investigations to establish those behind the chaos, some of whom they claim were still walking free. This comes in the wake of a recommendation by judges to have parts of the trial involving Deputy President William Ruto moved to Kenya or Tanzania.
The challenge is really now, how do you safeguard the security of everybody, witnesses, suspects, how do you ensure that the conduct of those trials locally does not disrupt peace or create other problems?
The presiding bench would have to consider so many things. All these events, the pulling out of witnesses, the dropping of the judge from the case, and so on and so forth, may be very weighty as to contribute to the final verdict.
If the court agrees to hear the cases in East Africa, the Kenyan case will be among those deferred from the initial location. The Rwandese genocide case was heard in Arusha at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. The Charles Taylor case was initially supposed to be heard in Sierra Leone, but was deferred to The Hague for security reasons.
That recommendation gives the impression that they are satisfied, that it is in the interest of justice to conduct the trials in Nairobi, or Kenya, or Tanzania.
If these cases are indeed moved to either Kenya or Tanzania, it will not just be a plus for the defense, the prosecution can also benefit from it. In fact, Fatou Bensouda, the chief prosecutor, in her submission on this matter, said that the judges could visit some of the 2008 post-election hotspots to get a better feel of the Kenyan cases. Asha Mwilu reporting for KTN in Nairobi.
Like the way he's been treated lately at our local airports, and we can authoritatively report that the government has now given orders to the Kenya Airports Authority to review the rules on who can access the VIP lounge at the airport following the alleged mistreatment of former Prime Minister Raila Odinga. Now, leader of Majority Aden Duale made the statement during Thursday's parliamentary session, that's today, in response to a question from Rarieda parliamentarian Nicholas Gumbo. Gumbo condemned the move by airport officials, saying the former Prime Minister deserved utmost respect.
The VIP 2 launch was available for his use. The Speaker says therefore misleading to report that the former Prime Minister was mistreated and handled differently from other dignitaries of his VIP status.
You cannot equate the former Prime Minister to Honorable Mbadi, any other cabinet secretary, or even Honorable Duale, that please allow the former Prime Minister to continue using VIP Lounge 3, not 2.
We should not have few people masquerading that they want to protect the former Prime Minister. Even us, some of us want to stand and protect the former Prime Minister. He is not an entity of a community. He is a Kenyan leader. He has a history. And we are going to respect him. The few who are saying we want to protect Raila Amolo Odinga does not need your protection.
The leader of majorities cannot purport to speak on behalf of the government.
Another story we've been following for you says that thousands of Somali refugees sheltered in Kenya are alarmed by the latest move to take them back to their country. Kenya is home to over 300,000 Somali nationals who fled their war-torn country. And as Angel Katusia found out, many of them say returning home is simply not an option.
Muhammad Ali runs a thriving clothing business in Nairobi's Eastleigh estate. He fled his war-torn country in 2002 and sought refuge at the Dadaab refugee camp before coming here. He is unsettled by the latest move to return refugees like him to Somalia.
Amekuja 2002 kutoka kwao, na kitu ambaye imemlete ni ile mambo ilikuwa hakuna amani katika kwao, ilikuwa vita, ilikuwa nini. Sasa alikuja kama mkimbizi.
Ali got official documents to live in Kenya as a refugee, but decided to do business, marry and settle here. He has been running this shop since 2006. Then came the wave of terror attacks after Kenyan troops entered Somalia to fight Al-Qaeda-linked group Al-Shabaab. It is a war he says he has paid for dearly.
Kila wakati kwa ajili ya hii jina ya Al-Shabaab imekuwa Msomali asuspectiwe, lakini Al-Shabaab sio Msomali peke yake.
He is just one of the dozens of Somali nationals who live here as refugees. They have settled and made a home here. For a majority of them, returning to Somalia now is not an option.
And when we have dealt with this matter, there was no any evidence of Somali refugee with these such attacks. We are asking those who don't have the legal documents, they should go back to Dadaab, Ifo, and then make a process to return them to their home.
But the Somali government assuring returnees of a safe environment back home.
When you are taking people, refugees, to their homes, before you relocate them, you have to prepare for the basic life arrangements. It's not a matter of you are taken tomorrow or the day after tomorrow.
Kenya has taken several initiatives to leverage international support for repatriation and resettlement of refugees in various international forums like the London Conference, 21st and 22nd IGAD Summit, and recent AU meeting in Addis Ababa.
But Somali nationals who have settled remain unconvinced.
It is time for business. Now, the government has consented to grant a third digital distribution license to local media owners, bringing to an end a protracted battle between media owners and the industry regulator, the Communications Commission of Kenya. According to the Ministry of Information, Communication and Technology, a third license will be floated and Kenyan broadcasters will be given priority, but will have to go through a competitive bidding process. Now, the move by the government seeks to mend the between the CCK and local broadcasters in a back and forth blame game that has lasted the better part of the last 2 years.
You see, we can't determine who we are going to give it to. It is a procurement process. We have to go to, we are subject to public procurement regulations, and we have to do this in a manner that obeys the public procurement regime. So whoever wins, we can't determine, of course, beforehand who's going to win that tender.
Firstly, there isn't a dispute between CCK and media owners. What the government has said today categorically is that a third license will be issued, and the Media Owner Association welcomes that because we believe that it is important that we are given the third license. And I have stated in my statement earlier on that we are ready and we are willing to go through a competitive process because we know that definitely we will be victorious in that endeavor.
Right, and we do hope that that battle will indeed come to an end. Moving on, Kenya is tightening its licensing regime for the farms coming into the country to prospect for oil and gas as the country's profile as a potential oil producer goes up. Now, the Ministry of Energy has issued new rules of prospecting to the farms that will be coming to the country, and this will see fees go up threefold. But now it says it is set to tighten the rules to ward off speculators and ensure that it attracts the serious explorers in the country.
With increased interest in the country for oil exploration, the government is now working on a master plan on effective management of petroleum resources. The plan is aimed at introducing checks and balances to ward off companies out to fleece the country of its potential wealth. This will also change the current mode of operating where the government has an open door policy of licensing the blocks on the basis of first come, first serve in favor of bid rounds.
We are revising our Act, Petroleum Act, to bring it in tandem with good international practice and also to align it to the new constitution and best practice.
Currently, Kenya has a total of 46 blocks, 44 of which have already been licensed to 23 international oil companies. The government is creating 7 additional blocks, raising the country's potential blocks to 53. Kenya will also see 7 new exploration wells drilled by the end of 2013 in a bid to evaluate hydrocarbon potential in its 4 sedimentary basins of Lamu, Mandera, Anza, and the tertiary rifts.
We need to prepare the government, we need to prepare even the local people to understand their expectations and their desires, and then help them understand the need for negotiation.
The new measures by government are not only aimed at locking off farms that are not serious with exploration, but also help raise the critical revenue needed by the exchequer for development purposes. Philip Keita, KTN Business Today.
Right, the United Nations has released a new report on the roadmap to eliminate extreme poverty in the globe by the year 2030. The globe is expected to offer a way forward after the Millennium Development Goal expires in just 2 years. Joseph Bonyo has more.
In the year 2000, the United Nations unveiled an 8-point global plan that it hoped would eradicate poverty in the globe. This was popular as the Millennium Development Goals. The aim of the MDGs was to encourage the poorest countries in the world to develop and thus cutting the levels of poverty. However, 13 years later, very little seems to have been done, and as a result of this, a new report has been launched to ensure that post the Millennium Development Goals, the world can eliminate poverty by at least half by the year 2030. It is out of this realization that 9 months ago, the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon formed a high-level panel of eminent persons to develop a report on post-Millennium Development Goals.
What we realize today is that we need to move one step further. We need to really have an agenda that embraces the social, the environmental, the economic and the political dimensions in an integrated manner.
The report has a 5-point roadmap that revolves around eradicating extreme poverty through a renewed global partnership with a focus on sustainable development.
I think the report is a bold, visionary document in many respects. It goes much way beyond the Millennium Development Goals. What's particularly interesting for me is the reference to tax evasion and the emphasis on domestic resource mobilization. So much, I mean, something like $1.2 trillion has been sucked out of Africa by companies that are not allowing themselves to be taxed as normal citizens are.
The report also champions a more inclusive approach in achieving the goals with an inclination to participation by citizens of the world as one people. Thus, it rides on the spirit of cooperation and mutual accountability from the government, the civil society and the citizens. With the launch of the report, the UN Secretary will in another 3 months will seek consent from the heads of member states at the UN Assembly for implementation of this report. If he gets a go-ahead on the same, the world will again be treated for a second time with another 15-year roadmap to eliminate poverty in the globe by the year 2030. Joseph Bonny, KTN Business Today.
Nigeria in a World Cup qualifier yesterday had a direct effect on the country's ranking in the world. Kenya dropped 1 position down to 123 from 122. Ivory Coast, the leading African country, retained their position but dropped in the world to position 13. Nigeria, who despite beating Kenya, dropped 3 places in the world rankings to number 31 but 4th in Africa. FKF, having the wake of defeat, maintained that it still has faith in coach Adel Amrouche and already working to put up a selection panel for the head coach, which will help him in scouting for players all over the country. FKF acknowledged that Kenya is in dire need of strikers to join Dennis Oliech.
His job is safe, at least for now, and Football Kenya Federation is seeking to widen the players' match net. FKF admitted that the national team's players' composition needs to be relooked at afresh. During Wednesday's match against Nigeria, it was evident that Kenya had no strikers. The over-reliance on Dennis Oliech has caught up with the Stars, and it cannot be gainsaid that there is need to go back to the drawing board.
I would not support anybody or any attempt to fire Amoroche because we have not given Amoroche time to deliver.
The Stars have 2 matches left in the campaign, but lucky for the Namibia tie next Wednesday, Origi and Oliech will be available for selection, while the process to increase the number of quality strikers continues.
I don't think today we deserve to lose, and we were just unlucky. They caught us well in the counter-attack and they scored, but I think today the best team lost.
If you have about 3 players not doing well, what are you going to do as a coach? Because you have only 3 substitutions. So we decided to Aswani was injured.
Why did they play then?
No, they were not injured when they were starting the game. Yeah, we cannot put someone who is injured in the game.
We need to put in place a system that will enable us to identify new players for the future of our national team.
Adel Amrouche, who watched Wednesday's match from the terraces following his 1-month suspension, will be on the bench next week. For KTN Sports, I'm Hassan Juma.
The draw for this year's Sakafa Club Championship continued to shrink following the withdrawal by Kenyan champions Tusker FC. The club's director also being wrote to the Football Kenya Federation confirming today of their withdrawal due to insecurity in Darfur and by extension Katguli, where Group B teams will be best. Tanzania's Simba FC pulled out early this week citing insecurity. Sakafa's Nicholas Musonye told KTN on phone that the decision by Tusker will come with consequences. That means that the team will have to pay hefty penalties. Tusker were pulled with Al Hilal Katguli, Al Nasir of South Sudan, Falcons of Zanzibar, Al Bidal Ahli of Shandi of Sudan. Moving on, Rebecca Matiko is part of the team that was booked the tickets to the World Olympics in Sofia, Bulgaria in July. Matiko was in a class of her own, winning the 800 meters race in a time of 2 minutes 21.3 seconds. She was followed by Janine Horimo, who clocked 2 minutes 26.2 seconds. Anna Simiu also made it to the list after finishing third. In the men's 800 meters, Baxon Menjo, Justus Kipkemboi and Edwin Kipchumba will represent the country. Sarah Wangare confirmed a place yesterday after winning the women's 10,000 meters. Kenya will be represented by Baxon Menjo, Luka Wanjiko and Peter Toritich in the 3,000 meters steeplechase. Now to some other story now. Samuel Papa and Ephantus Nyambura from Kenya are the champions of the third season of the Guineas Football Challenge. The two Kenyans bagged 1,800,000 shillings in the tightly contested finals that saw the red-hot Ghana lose narrowly after the penalty shootout. The battle of the West and East nations was evident courtesy of the wide soccer knowledge the two nations had. It was the first time the Guineas Football Challenge saw amazing level of competition, which was evidently still from day one. Ephantus Ngigi from Nairobi and Kefa Kimani from Thika were Kenya's representatives against Ghanaians Kofi Okraru and Isaac Ayi from Accra. The Kenya team displayed massive talent in the challenge. The Guineas Football Challenge has grown in scale for local Kenya contestants in the first season to Pan-African feel, with East and West African countries taking part.